What is genre and why is it important? In its most basic form, genre is just the taxonomical categorization of movies. Just like the taxonomy of animals, we categorize movies by common traits. Animals have much more distinct traits like bearing live young or having fur, but movies are more fluid, so the categorization can get complicated. Because it is difficult to narrow every single movie into a category, many people find it pointless to use genre because it is putting art into a box. Obviously, putting art into a box is not a good thing, however, genre is not a restrictive structure. Genre ebbs and flows. We can mix genres, have genre adjacents, and people can consider some movies in a different genre. Alien is both a sci-fi and a horror movie. Romantic comedies, a mix of genre in itself, has become its own separate genre. Even genres that seem like they could never work have been blended. The Evil Dead and Shaun of the Dead blend horror and comedy together, one of the hardest mixes you can do. Cowboys and Aliens blends the western genre and the sci-fi genre, which is probably the least represented blend. There are also subgenres within these genres. The Thing and Halloween are both horror movies, but they are of different subgenres. The Thing is a body horror movie, whereas Halloween is a slasher movie. The Conjuring is a haunted house movie. Night of the Living Dead is a zombie movie. All of these are horror movies, but within distinct subgenres. Silence of the Lambs is argued if it is even a horror movie. Some view it as just a thriller, others say it's firmly horror. There are also genre influences. Star Wars would not necessarily be considered a Western by most means. However, one of the heaviest inspirations for Star Wars is the legendary Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, who is known for making samurai epics like Seven Samurai and Throne of Blood. Now, Kurosawa has cited the American Western genre to be the inspiration for his samurai films, intending to make the Japanese version of the Western mythos. So in turn, Star Wars is heavily influenced by the Western and shares a lot of similarities with them. But it is obviously also a sci-fi fantasy space opera. That's a lot of genres. Interestingly enough, Star Wars has become its own genre unto itself. This is why people say that The Last Jedi is a good movie, but not a good Star Wars movie. This is where many people give up on genre. It has become so convoluted and nebulous that it seems pointless to even focus on genre. The movies don't change if we call them a certain genre. The plot doesn't change if I call Star Wars a Western or sci-fi. All the characters stay the same, the shots stay the same, literally nothing happens. If the label of a genre doesn't change anything, then what is even the point of talking about genre? Firstly, we need to understand how we classify genres. The taxonomy analogy I made earlier has animals categorized by traits such as bone structures, fur, bearing live young, etc. But like I said, genres are not as strictly defined like this. In order to find some sort of classifications, we look at two main concepts: conventions and iconography. Iconography, deriving from the word icon, is any icon, whether that be auditory or visual, that insinuates the genre. Iconography can be extremely simple and obvious. Some iconography of the horror genre would be butcher knives, blood and guts, creaky doors, dark settings. Iconographies of the Western are cowboys, cowboy hats, gun holsters, the West. Conventions, on the other hand, are tropes that are tied into what is happening on the screen. Conventions of slasher movies are dumb, horny teens dying after having sex, ambiguous endings, final girls. Conventions of the Westerns are duels, warfare with indigenous peoples, etc. Conventions of the rom-com are meet-cutes, the breakups, the crashing the weddings, etc. Because the classification of genres are not hard and fast, not every convention in iconography needs to be in a film to make it in that genre. Not every rom-com has a wedding crash, not every slasher has an ambiguous ending. However, it is the general trend of having multiple of these traits. This form of classification can also get complicated, as in, is The Mandalorian a Western? Is Jurassic Park a horror movie? But that's not what this video is about. These conventions in iconography are not fabricated, however. They grow and evolve naturally over time. A lot of the times, these traits are solidified because one film of the genre does really well and the copycats ensue, i.e., every horror movie after 1978 was just trying to be Halloween. But the influence of genre affects each genre differently, so we are going to look at some of these genres individually. The Western was the most popular genre in early American cinema. Between 1935 and 1952, there were 2,078 Western films, which is an average of 122 Westerns every single year, or 2.3 Western films every single week for 17 years. And people are arguing that superhero movies are destroying cinema. The importance of these statistics, though, is that the Western genre tanked in popularity in the 1960s. Surely a part of it was just overexposure, but it had been going on for so long that couldn't be the only reason. The Western genre is an incredibly dated genre that is objectively rooted in white supremacy. The genre glorifies manifest destiny and the conquering of indigenous lands. Many Westerns depict disgusting massacres of indigenous peoples and portrays them as savage and antagonistic to the goals of the main protagonist. The indigenous were depicted in stereotypes and sometimes not even played by indigenous actors. The Western hero is also the pinnacle of toxic masculinity, repressing emotions in order to be tough and solving problems with violence alone. Westerns have eye-roll-inducing pissing contests between the male protagonist and antagonist, and often depict women as either damsels in distress or immoral whores. The Western created a fictional mythology of the American West, but as the second half of the 20th century rolled around, the public understanding of America's history had begun to change, and so the representation of the American West didn't work on the new public consciousness. During and after the 1960s, there were two types of Westerns being made, albeit at a much lower rate. Spaghetti Westerns and revisionist Westerns, which both served a similar purpose of altering the genre to align with the new understanding of the West. This shows that the Western genre isn't just a label, but rather that these movies genuinely were a reflection of the time periods they were made in. Spaghetti Westerns were Western films that were made by Europeans, Italians mostly, and were shot in Italy and Spain. Because these filmmakers were European and not American, they did not have to uphold the mythos of the American West, and so these films had slightly better portrayals. It could be argued that spaghetti westerns are a type of revisionist western, but I think revisionist westerns are specifically made by Americans, as it was the process of Americans re-evaluating the genre. Revisionist westerns are what they sound like. They revise the problematic tendency of the genre. Some revisionist westerns cut out the atrocities against the indigenous people as to not glorify that aspect, and while that is an improvement, it is just ignoring the problem and pretending it didn't happen rather than analyzing it. Others take the issue of indigenous genocide head-on, critiquing the American imperialism. If you've seen my horror sequels video, you'll remember I talked about how the postmodernism of the counterculture in the 60s through the 80s influenced the film industry, and it works the same in the Western genre. Not only was the racial issues of the Western critiqued, but also the representation of gender within the Western. The Power of the Dog that came out last year depicts a seemingly typical Western hero in Phil being an abrasive man who prides himself on his stoic nature and chuckles at the harassment of people he deems less masculine than he. As the movie progresses, however, Peter, the kid Phil would harass, finds Phil in a secluded area meant to represent Phil being able to be himself and finally express who he is without the judgment of the world. Phil and Peter grow a bond, and the film alludes to the fact that Phil is actually closeted, but represses the side of him with his toxic masculinity. The Power of the Dog doesn't live in a vacuum. The story could have been set up in a lot of different time periods, but it was intentionally made as a Western because of the implications that the genre has. It is more impactful to see a Western hero have these characteristics than just a guy in modern day. Not only that, but it also is showing how the toxic masculinity solidified in society partially by the Western genre has affected men, and that the Western can actually be a tool for social change to fight against the damages of the earlier Westerns. Revisionist Westerns and spaghetti Westerns are movies that take themselves seriously, but that is not the only way that a Western uses genre to critique itself. Blazing Saddles is a satire parody Western film made by Mel Brooks. The movie, on the surface, contains extremely problematic racist content, but the movie is a satire and is intentionally like this in order to critique the racial issues of the Western. Blazing Saddles is made specifically as a Western because of the implications that the Western has on racial issues. The racists in the film are depicted as bumbling idiots. The racism isn't glorified, but rather portrayed as being the mindset of morons. The film implies that any person that thinks like this is a buffoon, like the ones in the film. Albeit to a different extent, Django Unchained does this, similar with the KKK scene, where they all complain about the bags over their heads not being good enough. The horror genre is an idiosyncratic genre that is tied more heavily to conventions and iconography, maybe more than any other genre. Horror is an extensive genre with countless subgenres like slasher, body horror, possession, etc., each with their own distinct tropes. Horror's relationship with genre is very different from the Western, though. The Western genre's evolution was a reflection of the societal outlook on morality and history. While the horror genre most definitely reflects the society it was made in, there is no revisionist horror to reassess the problems from the genre in the same ways Westerns do. Interestingly enough, while the Western was on a steep decline, horror was revolutionized. Before the 60s, horror was heavily censored by the Production Code Administration, which was the organization created to make sure films held up to the moral standards of society. With the downfall of the PCA in the late 50s, horror films flourished throughout the 60s and especially into the 70s and 80s. So the films reflected the change in society's expectations of what is taboo and what is morally acceptable. The tropes and iconography of the horror genre were planted in the 60s with films like Psycho and Night of the Living Dead, and then immortalized in the 70s with films like Halloween and The Exorcist. The film industry as a whole in the late 60s and 70s was influenced by the fall of the studio system in Hollywood. The downfall of the studio system led to a surge in independent cinema. Horror was heavily attached to the independent cinema movement because the genre is built on the obscene, and this new indie atmosphere wouldn't censor the horrors baked into the films. Horror also became prolific in the independent scene because of the cheapness of the films. It is very difficult to make a low-budget western or a period piece or war film, but making a low-budget horror movie is as easy as filmmaking can get. So schlocky horror film after schlocky horror film were churned out during this time. The independent and cheap nature of the genre led to the genre becoming very redundant. Every slasher movie made right after 1978 is an absolute rip-off of Halloween. Sean S. Cunningham, one of the most influential minds behind the Friday the 13th series, literally admitted that the original script for the Friday film was written to exploit the popularity of Halloween. Like with the plethora of westerns Hollywood produced in the earlier generation, a plethora of films within one genre leads to redundancies, but also solidification of conventions and iconography. This is why genres like horror and westerns are so much more well-defined than many other genres. The evolution of horror after the 80s was brought in by the staleness of the genre into the 90s. The redundancy of the genre solidified the conventions and iconography, but the redundancy also became, well, redundant. Almost every horror movie was just a sequel or a remake that hit the exact same beats as every other one. Horror in the 60s and 70s originated in cheap, independent movies, but as they gained traction in the next few decades, the down-to-earth nature dissipated. Literally, like a bunch of horror movies started being set in space and not in the cool alien way, in the Leprechaun way. Horror films plummeted into mediocrity and camp, and the genre was not taken seriously anymore. But if you follow this channel for a while, you all know what happened in that one fateful year.
Hello?
Scream is a perfect example of how we can use genre within the thematics of the story. Scream is a metatextual movie, which essentially means it points out parts of text that are outside of the movie it is in. It doesn't exactly break the fourth wall, but it gets as close to doing so as possible while still maintaining verisimilitude. The characters within the movie know that horror movies exist and understand the rules of the genre, which are essentially the conventions that are apparent throughout slashers. One of the characters, Randy, points out things like how you should never say, "I'll be right back," and you should never have sex in a horror movie because it always breeds death. The conventions mentioned by Randy happen within the movie when people don't listen to him, showing the formulaic nature of the conventions. There is a scene where Randy is watching Halloween from 1978, which I mentioned before is the blueprint for any slasher movie. While watching, he is yelling at the screen that the character needs to look behind them because Michael is there, while Ghostface is sneaking up on Randy. It is a great moment of dark comedy that is basically making fun of the audience that watches horror. Scream is also chock full of references such as a janitor being dressed up like Freddy Krueger and a reference to a Wes Carpenter flick, which is an amalgamation of Wes Craven and John Carpenter's names, the former being the director of Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street, and the latter being the director of Halloween and The Thing. These references are intentionally placed into the movie specifically for the horror fans. The film is completely tied to genre and doesn't exist in a vacuum. When I said earlier in the video that labeling something as genre doesn't change anything, well, this actually does. The horror genre and Scream are completely intertwined. Sometimes the relationship Scream has with genre is just for tongue-in-cheek references, sometimes it is there for comedic reasons, and sometimes it is there for thematic reasons, as in Scream is essentially calling out crappy horror movies and showing that horror movies can be incredible works of art. Similar to Blazing Saddles, horror gets Scary Movie. However, Scary Movie forgot to be clever and make a pointed argument like Blazing Saddles did. Another major factor in genre that I think gets overlooked in the genre conversation is the community that genre creates. I've spoken a lot about the horror genre in this video because, like I said, it is one of the most well-defined genres. Because of that, the community of die-hard horror fans is expansive. The horror genre is probably the genre with the largest cult following. Communities throughout the internet love horror movies and try to find all the cult indie movies from the 70s. There's something comforting about the redundancy of the conventions and iconography. Horror isn't alone though. People have their favorite genres and create groups based around that, like the fantasy genre community that cosplay and LARP. There's a recent trend where fans of a genre are almost being replaced by fans of franchises. Star Wars, Marvel, Lord of the Rings, etc. I don't think it is that different though, as fans of Lord of the Rings are often fans of Game of Thrones and World of Warcraft. Fans of Marvel are often fans of DC too. Franchises are just streamlining the genre conventions under one name. Because Star Wars is a conglomerate of genres, it has kind of become its own genre. Star Wars is a sci-fi, fantasy, space opera, western, samurai movie about religion and World War II. It is also the largest film franchise of all time and has arguably the most devout fandom ever. People love the conventions and iconography of Star Wars so much that even hearing or seeing random parts from the series can incite an eruption from the fans. To announce the new show, Star Wars just tweeted, "Hello there." Just hearing one of the leitmotifs from John Williams' score completely changes the thematics of a scene. That is the power of conventions and iconography. It is not putting art into a box. It is not pointless pedantics or unnecessary categorization. Genre influences so much of the media that we consume. That is why genre is so important.